The penthouse suite of the Larson Tower sprawled beneath the early morning sun, all glass and chrome, the epitome of sterile luxury. James Larson sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, his eyes scanning the quarterly reports on his tablet. The numbers were good, no, they were extraordinary, but his expression was one of practiced indifference. 45 stories below, the city buzzed with life, but up here, in the silence of success, James was alone. Mr. Larson, his assistant Mira entered the room with her usual efficiency, placing a cup of espresso beside him. Your 10 a.m. with the Tokyo investors is confirmed. Also, your sister called. Something about lunch next week. He nodded absently, his mind already onto the next piece of business. Work was predictable. Profits, losses, acquisitions. They were all solvable equations. Emotions, on the other hand, were a messy liability, one he'd eliminated a year ago when his marriage dissolved. Since then, he'd kept everything and everyone at arm's length. It was safer that way. Mira left and the quiet settled in again. James's phone buzzed on the table, a small red light blinking to indicate a new message. He swiped to open it, expecting another notification about stock prices or board meetings, but what he saw made him pause. The message was simple, short. Hey, could you help me out? I just need enough for baby formula. I promise I'll pay you back. I'm really sorry for asking. It was from Rebecca, his ex-wife. His chest tightened. Rebecca hadn't spoken to him in over a year, not since she walked out of the life they'd built together. The divorce was clean, precise, as clean as heartbreak could ever be. He'd assumed she wanted nothing to do with him, and for a while that had been mutual. But now, this message, so out of the blue, so vulnerable, was like a needle piercing the armor he'd spent months building around himself. He stared at the words, baby formula. James's fingers hovered over the screen, his mind a whirlwind. Was this a mistake? Why would she be asking him for help? The last time they'd spoken, they were screaming at each other, hurling accusations and resentments that left both of them bruised. He read the message again, his heart pounding louder in his ears. Baby formula. His thumb hovered over the reply button, the cursor blinking like it was daring him to respond. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to pretend he never saw it, but something in the message tugged at him. It was the word baby. The image of Rebecca, desperate and asking for something as simple as baby formula, was too much to ignore. Without allowing himself time to overthink, he typed back, I've transferred some money, you don't need to pay me back. Before doubt could creep in, he tapped send. He opened his banking app, fingers moving with the same cold precision he used when authorizing million-dollar deals. He didn't stop to consider how much was appropriate. He just typed in $1,000 and sent it. The confirmation flashed on the screen. Rebecca Hayes stared at her phone, the blood draining from her face. Her hands shook as she read James's message, her eyes darting to the bank notification that had followed it. Her breath caught in her throat. $1 million. This wasn't a joke. It was real. The proof sat in her bank account, cold and undeniable. Her mind raced. Panic surged through her veins. She wasn't supposed to message him. She'd been texting her friend, Lily, a simple, humiliating request for $50 to buy formula for her 7-month-old son, Lucas. Her rent was overdue, and the last of her savings had gone to medical bills. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, so she could stretch the little food she had for Lucas. Her pride was shattered, but she didn't care anymore, so as long as Lucas had what he needed. But somehow, in her exhausted haze, her trembling fingers had sent the message to James. And now, instead of $50, she had $1 million. Rebecca's vision blurred with tears. This was a mistake, a terrible, terrible mistake. James would think she was a fraud, a gold digger. The man who once loved her now likely believed she was trying to scam him. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she quickly typed a reply. James, I'm so sorry. That message wasn't meant for you. I didn't mean to. Her phone buzzed before she could finish. Another message from James. We need to talk. I'm coming over. Her heart clenched. James didn't know what to expect, but the surge of adrenaline in his veins made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in months. He had Rebecca's address saved, an old habit he'd never erased. He took the elevator to the parking garage, his jaw set, his mind swirling with possibilities. The drive to her apartment was a blur of city lights and unspoken questions. What was Rebecca's life like now? Why was she struggling for something as basic as baby formula? And why did the word baby gnaw at his brain like a splinter he couldn't dislodge? He parked and climbed the worn stairs to her third-floor unit. The building was old, the paint peeling, the air filled with the faint smell of damp carpet. This wasn't the life he thought Rebecca would have after him. He knocked. The door opened a crack, and there she was. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, dark circles shadowing her eyes. She looked thinner, fragile, a far cry from the vibrant woman he'd once known. But her gaze was fierce, protective. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." Then he heard it. The soft, unmistakable gurgle of a baby. James's world tilted. His eyes flicked down, and there, cradled against Rebecca's shoulder, was a baby boy with his mother's dark eyes and a tuft of chestnut hair that looked painfully familiar. He stumbled back a step, his mouth opening to speak, but no words came out. The pieces clicked together in his mind, each one sharper than the last. "Is he—" His voice cracked. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. She nodded. The truth landed like a punch to his gut. He had a son he never knew existed. His legs felt weak, his carefully constructed world fracturing with every heartbeat. He looked at Rebecca, his eyes pleading for answers, for something to ground him. But all he could hear was the baby's soft breathing and the sound of his own heart breaking. The silence between them was thick, oppressive. James's mind buzzed with a storm of confusion and disbelief. The baby's soft cooing felt like a drumbeat reverberating through his bones. A million questions fought for dominance, but he couldn't force a single word past the tightness in his throat. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, her arms tightening protectively around the baby. The boy, his son, squirmed slightly as though sensing the tension in the air. "Come in," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James stepped inside. The apartment was small, just a living room, a kitchenette, and one door that presumably led to the bedroom. Toys were scattered on the worn carpet, and a half-empty bottle of formula sat on the coffee table. The place smelled faintly of baby powder and desperation. Rebecca gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing, his eyes fixed on the child. The boy's eyes were wide, curious, and impossibly dark. His hair curled gently at the edges, a soft chestnut brown, the same shade James saw every morning in the mirror. "His name is Lucas," Rebecca said, her voice trembling. "He's 7 months old." James's breath caught. 7 months. He did the math in his head, the calculations slicing through him like a razor. 7 months ago they had been divorced for 4 months. She must have known she was pregnant when she left him. Why didn't she tell me? His eyes finally lifted to meet Rebecca's. "Why?" he managed to croak. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her gaze wavered, guilt and pain flickering in her expression. "I wanted to. I almost did. So many times. But—" She sighed, sinking onto the sofa, her shoulders hunched. "You were so closed off by the end, James. It felt like you were already gone. Telling you felt pointless." James's jaw clenched. "You thought I wouldn't care. I thought you'd resent us," she whispered, "that you'd see him as just another problem to solve. You were consumed by work, by the company. There was no room left for anything or anyone else. I didn't want Lucas to grow up feeling like he was unwanted." He felt as though she'd slapped him. The worst part was he couldn't argue. She was right. By the time their marriage ended, he had buried himself so deeply in his work that everything else had become a blur, even her. He'd let his ambition consume their life together, thinking that providing a luxurious future would make up for his absence. It hadn't. James swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. His gaze flicked to Lucas again, who was now gnawing on his tiny fist, his eyes still fixed on the stranger in the room. "Does he know about me?" James asked, his voice raw. Rebecca shook her head. "He's too young to understand, but I've told him stories. About you, about who you are." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Who I am. I'm a stranger, Rebecca. A name on a piece of paper. A bank account that accidentally dropped $1 million into your lap." She winced. "I didn't ask for that, James. I didn't want your money." "Then why send the message?" His voice rose, frustration seeping in. Her eyes welled up. "I didn't mean to send it to you. I was asking Lily for a loan. I was desperate. I hadn't slept in days. I must have tapped your contact by mistake." She let out a shuddering breath. "When I saw your reply, I panicked. I didn't know how to undo it." James took a shaky breath, trying to process it all. The image of her, alone and desperate enough to ask for baby formula, gutted him. This was the woman he had once promised to protect, to cherish, and he'd failed spectacularly. He sank onto the edge of the armchair, his elbows on his knees. "Why are you struggling so much? I thought the settlement was enough to keep you secure." "It was," she admitted. "But things changed. Lucas was born prematurely. There were complications. Hospital bills piled up faster than I could manage. My insurance barely covered half of it. I used up the settlement trying to keep us afloat." She looked away, her voice breaking. "I took a leave from work to care for him, but then I lost my job. Everything spiraled." James's gut twisted. He'd spent the last year swimming in excess, buying new properties, expanding his empire. Meanwhile, Rebecca had been drowning alone, trying to keep their son alive. "Our son." The words felt alien and yet undeniable. "I didn't know," he murmured. "I didn't want you to know," she admitted. "I was ashamed. I didn't want you to think I was weak." James's chest ached. "Rebecca, you were never weak. You were the strongest person I knew." His voice softened. "You still are." Her eyes met his, filled with uncertainty. For a moment they were just two people, stripped of their defenses, the weight of the past pressing between them. "Do you want to hold him?" she asked, her voice hesitant. James's heart skipped. Fear and longing warred within him. What if he wasn't cut out for this? What if he held his son and felt nothing? But when Rebecca stood and gently placed Lucas in his arms, the world shifted. The baby's warmth seeped through James's shirt, the tiny weight more profound than anything he'd ever held. Lucas's eyes met his, unguarded and pure. In that moment, something inside James shattered. A dam of emotions he hadn't realized he'd been holding back broke free. His throat tightened, and tears burned his eyes. This was his son, a living, breathing piece of him. Lucas's fingers curled around his thumb, soft and trusting. The simplicity of the gesture undid him. Rebecca watched, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He deserves to know you," she whispered. "If you want to be in his life." James looked up, his vision blurred. "I do," he choked out. "I want to know him. I want to know you again." A fragile silence filled the room, hope flickering in the spaces between the pain. For the first time in a year, James felt something real, something worth fighting for. James's world felt like it was spinning off its axis. Holding Lucas had cracked something open inside him, a reservoir of feelings he hadn't known existed. Or maybe he'd just buried them too deep to recognize. The weight of his son in his arms, the warmth of tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, was more grounding than any business deal or boardroom conquest. But the moment of fragile peace shattered quickly. Reality was a relentless force, and it had questions that demanded answers. Rebecca's voice broke the quiet. "You don't have to decide everything right now, James. I know this is a lot to take in." He gently handed Lucas back to her, his hands trembling as they left the baby's warmth. "No," he said, his jaw tight. "We need to figure this out. I need to be in his life." Her eyes searched his face. "Are you sure? This isn't something you can walk away from. If you're in, you're in." His throat tightened. "I'm in." But doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. Could he really do this? His life was a machine calibrated down to the minute. He didn't know the first thing about being a father. And Rebecca, they were tangled in so much hurt and history. Could they rebuild anything out of this wreckage? Rebecca seemed to sense his hesitation. She nodded slowly. "Okay, but this can't just be about guilt, James. Lucas needs more than just your presence. He needs your commitment." "I understand." The words felt hollow in his mouth. Did he truly understand? The past year of solitude had insulated him from the world's messiness. Now the walls were caving in, and he wasn't sure he was strong enough to hold them up. A knock at the door startled them both. Rebecca frowned, shifting Lucas to her other arm. Who could that be? She moved to the door, glancing back at James, her eyes wary. When she opened it, the color drained from her face. Standing in the hallway was Nathan Carter, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a confident posture that bordered on arrogance. His eyes flickered over Rebecca with a familiarity that sent a chill down James's spine. "Rebecca," Nathan said, his voice smooth. "I tried calling. We need to talk." James's hands clenched into fists. "Who is this?" Rebecca's eyes darted between the two men, panic setting in. "Nathan, this isn't a good time." Nathan's gaze shifted to James, his lips curling into a smirk. "You must be the ex, heard a lot about you." James's jaw tightened. "And you are?" Nathan stepped inside, uninvited, his presence filling the small apartment. "I'm the guy who's been helping Rebecca since you decided to disappear." He looked back at Rebecca. "You didn't mention he'd be here." Rebecca's voice was strained. "Nathan, please, not now." James felt the floor tilt beneath him. Helping her? The words tasted bitter. "What does he mean, Rebecca?" She took a deep breath, her eyes pleading. "James, it's not what you think." But the damage was done. His mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had she replaced him? Had this man been here, filling the role James had abandoned? Nathan's smirk deepened. "Seems like you've been left in the dark, buddy. Maybe you should ask Rebecca why she really didn't want you to know about Lucas." James turned to Rebecca, his face pale. "What is he talking about?" Tears welled in her eyes. "James, please, let's talk about this privately." "No," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I want to know now." Nathan folded his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "She didn't tell you because she wasn't sure you deserved to know. After all, you were never really there for her, were you?" The words struck like a blow. James's vision blurred with rage and hurt. He turned to Rebecca, his voice shaking. "Is that true?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want it to be, but by the time I found out I was pregnant, it felt like you were a million miles away. I was scared, James. Scared you wouldn't care, or worse, that you'd see Lucas as a mistake." James's heart pounded. "So you decided for me. You cut me out of his life. I thought I was protecting him," she cried, her voice breaking. "Protecting both of us." Nathan's voice dripped with disdain. "Seems like she made the right call." James's restraint snapped. He turned to Nathan, his voice cold. "Get out." Nathan's smile faltered. "Excuse me." "You heard me." James's eyes burned with controlled fury. "Get out." For a moment, Nathan seemed ready to argue, but something in James's expression made him reconsider. He snorted softly and turned to Rebecca. "Call me when you're ready to deal with reality." He walked out, the door closing with a finality that left the room suffocatingly silent. James ran a hand through his hair, his entire body trembling. "How long has he been in your life?" Rebecca wiped her tears, her voice small. "He's just a friend, someone who helped when I had no one else." He looked away, the ache in his chest unbearable. "You should have had me." She reached out, her fingers grazing his arm. "I know, and I'm sorry. I made mistakes, but I never stopped wanting you to know him, to be his father." James's shoulders slumped. The anger drained away, leaving only exhaustion and a hollow grief. "Where do we go from here?" he whispered. Rebecca's voice was soft. "We try. For Lucas's sake, we try." He looked at his son, who slept peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the storm raging around him. In that tiny, serene face, James saw a future that terrified him, but also one that gave him hope. "I want to be here," he said, his voice firm. "I want to know him, to know you again." Rebecca nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Then let's figure it out. Together." It wasn't a resolution, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. James sat in his car outside Rebecca's apartment building, the engine off, his mind caught between two worlds. The quiet hum of the city around him was muffled by the storm raging inside his head. The conversation with Rebecca played on a loop, her voice breaking, the tears in her eyes, and the unwavering weight of truth between them. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He had promised to try, to be there for Lucas, to fix what had been broken. But the reality of that promise was heavy. This wasn't a corporate deal or a solvable equation. This was life, raw, messy, and unforgiving. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Mira. He let it ring. He couldn't deal with work right now. The life he'd built with ruthless precision felt like a distant echo, a hollow shell compared to the storm of emotions swirling around Lucas and Rebecca. He closed his eyes, his mind drifting back to the moment he first saw his son. That tiny, fragile boy who had no idea the chaos surrounding his existence. Lucas didn't care about their past mistakes or failures. He just needed love, security, and a father who showed up. James took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. It was time to face the chaos, to stop running, to stop hiding behind walls of success and solitude. The next morning, James was back at Rebecca's door, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He'd barely slept, but his mind was clear. Rebecca answered, surprise flickering across her face. She shifted Lucas to her hip, his sleepy eyes blinking up at James. "You're here," she said softly. He nodded. "I told you I'm in. And I meant it." She stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment was the same, but something felt different. Maybe it was the shift in his own perspective. The walls weren't just walls. They were the boundaries of his son's world. The toys on the floor weren't clutter. They were the beginnings of a childhood. He set the duffel bag down. "I brought a few things. I figured I could stay for a few days, if that's okay with you." Rebecca nodded, her eyes softening. "It's more than okay." He looked at Lucas, who was chewing on his tiny fist, his dark eyes curious. James crouched down to his level. "Hey, buddy," Lucas gurgled, a little bubble of laughter escaping his lips. James felt his heart expand in his chest. Rebecca watched them, tears glistening. "He likes you." "I like him too," James whispered, his voice thick. They spent the morning together, a fragile rhythm beginning to form. James helped feed Lucas, his large hands awkward with the tiny spoon, but Lucas didn't seem to mind. They laughed when Lucas smeared mashed bananas across his face, and for the first time in a long while, the laughter felt real, unforced. As the hours passed, James began to see a future, not the one he had planned, but one that felt richer, more genuine. It terrified him, but it also grounded him in a way that nothing else ever had. That evening they sat on the worn sofa, Lucas dozing in Rebecca's arms. The soft glow of the lamp cast shadows on the walls, wrapping them in a cocoon of quiet intimacy. "James," Rebecca said softly, breaking the silence. "What happens now?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. "I don't have all the answers, but I know I want to be part of Lucas's life. And yours, if you'll let me." Her gaze searched his face. "Do you really think we can fix this? After everything?" He took her free hand, his fingers brushing against hers. "I don't know if we can fix the past, but maybe we can build something new." She let out a shaky breath. "I want that too, but I'm scared, James. I can't go through losing you again." "You won't." His voice was firm. "I was a coward before. I let my fears and ambitions blind me, but not anymore. You and Lucas, you're what matters now." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's try." He leaned in, his forehead touching hers. For a moment, the weight of the world lifted, and they were just two people holding on to hope. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a delicate routine. James balanced his work and time with Lucas, learning the nuances of fatherhood, the midnight feedings, the diaper changes, the endless soothing of tears. Each challenge humbled him, stripped away the layers of the untouchable CEO, revealing a man who was still learning, still growing. Rebecca watched him cautiously at first, but as days turned to weeks, her walls began to lower. She saw the effort, the sincerity, and the love that grew between James and Lucas. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One night, after Lucas was asleep, they sat on the balcony, the city lights twinkling below them. "I'm thinking of moving out of the city," Rebecca said, her voice tentative. "Somewhere quieter where Lucas can have space to play. Fresh air, trees, a different life." James's chest tightened. The thought of them leaving terrified him, but he nodded. "If that's what you want." "It's what I need," she corrected. "But I don't want to run away from you, James. I want you to come with us." He looked at her, the invitation shimmering between them. It wasn't just a chance to be with them. It was a chance to start over, to redefine what success and happiness meant. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steady. "Let's build something new." The move wasn't easy. It took months of planning, of untangling lives and expectations. But one bright spring morning, they settled into a small house surrounded by trees, the air filled with birdsong and possibility. James stood on the porch, watching Lucas toddle across the grass, his chubby legs wobbly but determined. Rebecca stood beside him, their fingers intertwined. "You okay?" she asked. He smiled, a real unguarded smile. "I'm more than okay." Lucas turned, his face lighting up. "Daddy!" he squealed, running toward James. James bent down, scooping his son into his arms. The word, "Daddy," echoed in his heart, filling the spaces he didn't know were empty. Rebecca leaned in, her lips brushing his cheek. "We did it." He looked at her, his eyes shining. "Yeah, we did." It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was the one he chose. and it was enough.